A lot of these conversations feel like you're standing on the edge of a very tall diving board and you're like not quite, you have that feeling in the pit of your stomach. You're like, I don't know if this is the right time to bring it up. But the thing is that the diving board does not get any lower. It really, you feel that same sense of nervousness, at least I do. So you might as well take the leap. And if the person responds positively and is, interested in having these conversations, that's a good sign. If they're resistant or like, why are we talking about money, like that's not important right now, or like that's kind of a flag of like, well, say more about that. If you do follow this process and are intentional with your approach, you do less resulting, which is looking at the outcome to determine whether you made a good decision. You are more confident in the process and therefore you'll be okay even if things go sideways.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Extrospective podcast with your host, Zach Villeneuve-Snell. In this week's episode, I am joined by Abby Davisson, who is the co-author of Money and Love, an intelligent roadmap for life's biggest decisions. She is now the founder and CEO of the Money and Love Institute and is just embarking on a journey of writing a monthly newsletter, exploring and expanding on many of the concepts from this work. In this conversation, we explore her own journey and why she's written the book in response to that, but also a little bit about some of the key themes within the book. So we cover the 5 C's, the things to consider carefully before making a decision. We unpick whether someone can be too spontaneous or too over planning and how to find the balance of that, or whether you should just lean into whatever your strength is. We unpick these things in the world of dating, in the world of marriage, in the world of having kids, but also in the world of moving cities and making a big career decision. Essentially, this podcast is going to be really helpful for you if you've got a big decision coming up, or if you may have to make big decisions regularly, or if you struggle with decision making. Hopefully this episode will give you the tools to be able to do that with slightly more confidence. And if this episode isn't enough, then of course you can purchase her book and follow her work via the links in the show notes. But without further ado, this was a great conversation from my perspective. I'm very much making some big decisions in my life at the moment, such as choosing to stay in Bournemouth for the final year of university rather than move back to Surrey. So if you enjoy, please do share it around. Welcome to the show, Abby Davisson. Abby Davisson, welcome to the Extrospective podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much for spending or giving your time this afternoon to chat with me. I've seen you appear on many different podcasts, Chris Williamson, a couple of my friends, Development by David, and Canberra Conversations as well. And I'm really happy that he kind of passed on your details. How have you found going around and sharing your story and your expertise on all these podcasts? It's like the new public fame, right? It's like a new chapter in your life.
It's been so fun. I mean, I'm an extrovert, so it gives me energy to talk to people all over the world. And it's been such a gift to get to connect with people who are being deliberate about all sorts of ways to approach life. And I just enjoy these conversations so much.
Fantastic. And I think as someone who's interested in pursuing clinical psychology and I love understanding how our brains work, the process of decision making, especially with Money and Love, which is obviously the book that you released at the beginning of the year, spoke to me as like, okay, this is a conversation I need to have. I need to try and have this conversation with you because it ties into so many of the things that I'm interested in. And obviously, for people that are listening, they're always making big decisions. I've just made a massive decision in my life personally, having not spoken to you. So I wonder whether you could shed lights on some of those things throughout the conversation. But for the listeners' context, and I would have introduced it very briefly before the conversation started on the podcast. But if you could explain a little bit about who you are and a little bit why you wrote the book for the listeners' benefit, I appreciate that.
Sure. So I'm Abby Davisson, as you mentioned. I'm the author of Money and Love, an intelligent roadmap for life's biggest decisions. I spent the first several decades of my career as a social innovation leader in all of the different sectors, public, private, nonprofit, was most recently at Gap Inc., the global apparel retailer, leading their corporate foundation, and am now on an entrepreneurship journey. So, as you mentioned, the book came out in January, and I've just stood up a business related to the book. But the book really had its genesis over 15 years ago in a course that my co author, Professor Myra Strober, taught at Stanford Business School. So that's where we met. And she is a labor economist and was one of the first female professors at the business school had ever hired. She taught this course. It was called Work and Family, and I took it with my boyfriend at the time. We had met in business school, and we were trying to decide. It was our second year. We were getting ready to graduate. We were trying to decide, do we look for jobs in the same city? Do we accept jobs in the same city? Should we move in together if we end up in the same city? And my co-author had shared a surprising piece of data, our professor, that couples who live together before getting married have higher divorce rates. That was very surprising to us. We did not expect that, and we certainly didn't want that to happen to us. And so we wrote a paper. We ended up writing our final paper all about why that is, if there can be anything done to avoid that fate. And it turns out, yes, there is. It's being intentional about how you combine your life with someone else. And so we did. We moved in together. We got married the following year. Tomorrow is actually our 14-year wedding anniversary. We had two young kids along the way, many job changes, and we came back to my co author's class as guest speakers for many years. And when she retired in 2018, she said she wanted to write a book about the class. And I said, that would be great. It's changed so many lives, including ours. And then when we had lunch about a year later, I said, how's the book going? And she said, I have not written a word. And so I said to her, well, maybe you need an accountability partner. I had just launched the employee resource for working parents at Gap, and I did that with a co founder, a working dad, and that was so helpful. And she said, well, you know what? That's a great idea, but I need more than that. I need a co author. And would you write this book with me? And so right then and there, I said yes. And we violated the first principle of our book, which is never make big life decisions in an instant. And in that moment, we decided to write the book together, and that's the journey we've been on. And it's been so fabulous, and couldn't even have predicted how fantastic it has gone.
And you never could have anticipated that after taking the class, that all these years later you'd stay in touch and then there'd eventually be a book to emerge out of it. What was the reason for you being interested in that class or even the course in general? Have you mentioned what the degree was in?
It was an MBA degree. I actually got the joint degree with the education school. So Myra was the director of that joint degree program. So I got to know her in multiple contexts. So even though I say it was a split second decision, we had known each other for over a decade, and I knew very much that we already got along. But yeah, the course was offered at the business school, and I had spent a lot of my early and mid 20s making big life decisions and being very strategic about my career decisions, because the conventional wisdom is to, first of all, separate decisions about money, career, finances from decisions about love, relationships, and use your head to really analyze those financial and career decisions, and follow your heart when it comes to relationship decisions. Don't let money get in the way, because that's materialistic. And when I was making the decisions according to that conventional wisdom, it felt like I didn't quite know if I was approaching them the right way. I was very focused on, the outcome to determine whether it was a good decision or not. If I, started dating someone and, you know, got my hopes up and it went sideways, it was like, oh, that was a bad decision to, follow this person to a new city. Or, if a career decision went well, it was like, well, that was a good decision to take that job, right? But the truth is, and what drew me to the class is that I was really lost, because that conventional wisdom is really not good. It's that all of life's biggest decisions have a component of money and a component of love to them, and when you silo them, when you make them separately, you're not thinking holistically. You're missing a big part of the picture, and you're more likely to make decisions you regret.
Okay, and so just thinking about like the kind of character and the kind of temperament that you had coming into this, what is it that led you to be interested in this sort of thing? I heard of some other podcasts that you're an overanalyzer and you like making the decisions kind of almost like me as well, kind of like planning everything out and kind of mitigating for risk here and there. But I kind of as a almost as a kid, right? A question I often ask on the podcast is what you like as a kid, because I think that builds such a really interesting picture of why the person's made decisions later on in their life. So is there anything you can kind of pick out of how you were as a child that then led through to pursuing this and ultimately going full circle and writing a book on it?
Yeah, well, I think there were two things. One, I was definitely an extreme planner as a kid. So I for example, when I was 9 years old, I kept a diary where I would write what I was going to wear at summer camp for an entire summer, like 10 weeks. Every single day I would plan out, what my outfit was. I like fashion. So even then, that was something that was fun for me, but also just that desire to plan and to know what something was going to be like was a big need of mine. And then also, my parents had a very traditional arrangement where my father was the breadwinner and they had moved, cities for his career. And my mother paused her career. She was a librarian to raise me and my brother. And, even when she went back to work, it was on a school schedule. So she would have the summers off. And I admired their relationship. They had a wonderful marriage for over 50 years, but I was ambitious about my career and my personal life. And I wanted to know how to pursue both in a way that would not require me to make the types of trade offs that I saw my mother making in order to pursue a family life. And I mean, that was a bit of what the bill of goods that my generation was sold, is that, oh, you can have it all. But I didn't have role models who were illustrating how to do that. And I did want to be planful because I had, as I mentioned, made a series of decisions in my early and mid 20s that I felt I had not approached in an ideal way when it came to my personal life. And this was a appealing way to have a labor economist, someone who's all about the data, talk to you about the biggest life decisions that you face as a individual, as a manager, as a leader, and how to make sure you're going into them with your eyes wide open, aware of all the potential costs and benefits, and without ignoring your heart along the way. And so that was very appealing to me.
Off the top of my head, I don't know if you know the kind of there's a matrix of like the game theory of like split and steal, right? Where you can make a risk, but then you can gain more, or you can have the more conservative, like rational, calculated option of like just hoping that both of you do the same thing. And I studied economics a little bit at university, and it just kind of springs to mind there where the more risk averse, sort of like over planning temperament is to play it safe, and maybe the spontaneous risk loving side can have a bigger upside. And I'm just curious as to, you mentioned there that you'd plan out your whole summer's outfits almost like day by day in a diary, right? And not in the same regard, but I think I've probably been guilty of doing a lot of that over planning. Do you think that, as with kind of psychological temperament, like disagreeableness, for example, or agreeableness, is like you want to aim to kind of converge the center and be balanced? Is it the same, or to try and you want to kind of be balanced in terms of how planning you are and how spontaneous you are, or should you like lean into the strengths of your natural character of like, actually I'm just going to be the best planner there is, and then surround myself with spontaneous people?
Oh, I love that question. Well, I think it's very important to know your decision making type, kind of what your innate tendency is. And we actually have a quiz on our website, moneylovebook.com, that people
I did
can.
it just before the podcast, and
Oh,
I mean, I'll
okay.
let you take a guess what I am.
I have a suspicion. You're an analyzer.
That is what that's what it says. Yeah.
Yes. Well, interestingly, I am not, and I think I am more balanced now. But I think it's a result of a lot of this the journey I've been on over the last 15 years since I took the course. But it's important to know your innate tendency because that is what you lean towards, and certainly when you're stressed and when you're in the throes of a big life decision, what you cling to a bit as a sense of security or safety. And when you are aware of your tendency, you can actually start to guard against some of the pitfalls that come with an extreme version of that tendency. So with analyzers, the risk is analysis paralysis, right? You get so into your spreadsheets and you have all these additional tabs and want every piece of data before you make your decision. And you can't know everything. We don't have crystal balls. And so sometimes, as you mentioned, that might lead to a suboptimal outcome because you are not acting quickly enough or you're missing out on opportunities. And so knowing that, you can actually start to do things like give yourself a time limit for a decision, or start to say, okay, I'm going to research this for I'm going to talk to two people or three people, and after that third, piece of input, I'm going to force myself to make a decision. Now, there's folks who are on the opposite extreme who are just kind of jumping into decisions, trusting their gut. They're sort of the ready, fire, aim types who are skipping a lot of that information gathering, sometimes to their detriment, right? Where they're jumping into a decision, and if they know that they are have a tendency to be gut trusters and like to just decide without having to go through the motions of gathering all the information, that again can lead them to being impulsive, and they can put some checks in place to avoid some of the mistakes and the challenges that can come with in a tendency towards impulsivity. So I think it's not about striving for perfect balance, because as we know that doesn't exist, but it's about being aware of your tendency to put some checks in place that will enable you to turn over some additional rocks, or maybe not turn over all the rocks that you'd like to be able to have a more desirable process.
With once someone's like trying to identify where they fit in terms of being super over planning and super spontaneous, is it helpful for them to kind of do the inner work of like understanding why they are like that? And like how do you go about that process of, say for example, with me being an over planner, something that I've kind of really tried to work out, like where in my parents have influenced me to be like this versus in school, or is it like a genetic thing? Is that something that you encourage people to do?
I think if you're interested in it, why not? I don't think that it's a requirement. More just the awareness and the knowledge of, okay, I know that I can be this way. And so, to your point, especially if you have a partner and you're trying to make decisions together, if they have the same tendency, you're going to actually have to guard against that analysis paralysis even more. There's a famous story of Steve Jobs trying to decide on the couch that and the refrigerator and I guess it was a washing machine or a couch or something, and it was like they had no washing machine for years because they couldn't decide on the model and like the benefits of the German washing machines versus the right. They were just really focused on, he was all about the details, right? And that's what made him so brilliant at designing products. But if you have multiple people who have that tendency, it can be really challenging. And I think similarly, if you tend towards being an analyzer and you're in a relationship, a close relationship with someone who is more of a gut truster, that can cause some friction. And so less about excavating your own life about, why am I this way, and more about, well, this is who I am. So how can I then make sure that I'm not, you know, that it's not a detriment to my personal relationships, that I am this way, and that we are finding a way to move forward even with our tendencies that either are complementary or in so much alignment that they're kind of pushing us towards the extreme.
Obviously, you mentioned how in relationships it's probably a good idea to be somewhat. I mean, Christians use the term like equally yoked, like somewhat similar. But do you think, like, I'm sure we'll talk about relationship stuff a little bit later on the podcast, but do you think there's any like major imbalances between like men and women when it comes to forward planning and these kind of decisions, or do you think it's pretty much just individual based? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't think, and I'm not aware of any research that aligns, these decision making tendencies towards gender. What I do know is that women are much more aware of some of um, the trade offs that are associated with, for example, like peak fertility years, right? Whereas, I think men, because they're not carrying children, they're not as aware of their biological clocks. It's a different situation, right? And so I know that there can be situations where, women are typically seen as the ones who are pushing for decisions around marriage, pushing for decisions around children. I don't think it's because they're more of a planner. I think it's because there are real realities when it comes to biology, and because of, the nature of being the one who carries the child, they are much more aware of those.
And I definitely want to come onto that because that was a lot of what your work was at Gap, right? It was kind of like looking at family dynamics, balancing your own journey as well of becoming a mother whilst also trying to work full time. And obviously, you alluded to it briefly in the conversation. But I kind of want to lead this conversation almost through in the steps that someone would almost take out in their life, right? So you start from being single, not really knowing what you're doing in the world, and kind of taking these steps both in your career and in love forward, I guess. Hopefully that can provide somewhat of a roadmap and questions along the way. I think that's probably a good way to frame this. And so if I kind of I imagine someone at 18, 19, many of the listeners maybe around this age demographic, and they're making decisions on where to go to university, what to study, and obviously in that journey as well comes, do they get involved with anyone romantically and stuff? What are kind of the um, thought processes or mindsets that someone should go into these big decisions with, rather than jumping in or being led with their emotions, or what's the kind of baseline there?
Yeah, so part of what was new in the book is this idea of having a framework that you can use to approach big life decisions. So the class talked about all those life decisions, but didn't have one single framework for how to think about them. And so that was really what we pushed ourselves to do for the book, because we wanted something that was flexible, meaning it could be applied to a variety of life decisions, everything from who is my person, all the way to how do I want to be cared for or care for my parents when they're aging and unable to care for themselves, but really sturdy, meaning that it could actually be uh, reliable and you could apply it to a variety of life decisions using the same approach. And so we call ours the 5 C's. And the first C, I think, is really critical, and it's for exactly the example you were mentioned, going to university and determining what to study. It's really about clarifying what is most important to you, and that is easier said than done because there are so many people who are influencing us when it comes to what we want. There are certainly parents, teachers, role models that may be weighing heavily on our mind when we think about what path to follow, both in a career and a personal life. But there are also our peers. And French philosopher Rene Girard had this key insight around a term he called mimetic desire, which is that our wants are powerfully influenced by others' wants. And so if you're interested in psychology, and yet all of your friends are focused on economics, you might say, oh, well, I guess economics is very practical. It seems like the path to go down to get a job that's going to be lucrative. Maybe I should really change my major, right? So there are ways that we're influenced without even really being aware that we need to be conscious of and spend some time untangling those our wants from all of those other influences in order to have that clarity.
And I find it interesting you mentioned there about the peers, because almost we see like the majority opinion as being more correct just by proxy of it being the majority, especially when it comes to our friendship circles, even though that can be completely not the case at all. It's a logical fallacy, which I think is funny. And so then obviously you mentioned the 5 C's. One of them is also kind of consequences as well, and I suppose that comes to the discussion around risk. Like, you're kind of weighing up the benefits and drawbacks of, okay, if I move to this city, if I take this job, will I risk being fired and then being unemployed? Or, especially with relationship, there's a lot of like questioning around that. But speaking about relationships, and it's actually something that I've kind of thought about in the last couple of years, is the balance of making a decision based on like a spark and like emotion, but then also like allowing to consider that and then also look at the practicality. And I think you can definitely overdo it on both, and I've probably been guilty of both in different scenarios. So, as something that we're told is very much a love, follow with your heart thing, how do you bring like rationality into that? Because as you mentioned at the beginning, the statistic about moving in together and divorce rates is when you're intentional, that's when you can mitigate some of those risks.
Yes, and the second C is all about is actually called communicate, right? And so what is hard is these are really hard decisions to or hard discussions to have early on in a relationship. When my then boyfriend and I were talking about, do we look for a job in the same city and do we move in together? We had only been together for about a year, less than a year, and that was very risky to have these conversations. And yet, because we had the class sort of forcing us, and a project that needed to be completed, we were willing to or kind of move past that discomfort of, oh, this feels risky to disclose something to this person, or like I don't really, so many things are left unsaid in relationships because we aren't comfortable being vulnerable, right? And so what is important, though, certainly in a long-term relationship, is being vulnerable, is sharing your deepest darkest desires with someone so that they can support you on that journey and they can be part of helping you achieve those desires. And so it's often we think of, as I mentioned, we sort of compartmentalize our career decisions and then we have our romantic decisions. And the truth is that um, your career decisions are very much dependent on the person that you end up with long term for life. Because if they aren't willing to move to a new city, for example, if you get a job offer that you're interested in, if they're not willing to, if you decide to have children, if they're not willing to or don't want to be an equal partner in raising those children and running a household, it has very, very significant career implications. And it's very hard to know that before you have children, before you have this life together. But what was very helpful for us in taking the class is seeing a lot of different examples. There were lots of guest speakers as part of the class who shared very openly about mistakes that they had made, about conversations they had too late, about regrets that they had. And that was so powerful to help us realize, oh, yes, even though it's uncomfortable to have these conversations, it's so much better to do it on the front end than to, have them too late. And once you already have, made some decisions, maybe not intentionally, and now are dealing with the ramifications.
Yeah, I suppose if you allow yourself to get caught up too emotionally and it's like a runaway train without actually having the discussion on, okay, where are we actually going? Where's the vision for this? And being on the same page in terms of where you want to live, what you want to do. That's the situation that you're almost describing there, where you can get a little bit stuck. Do you think there's a bit of nuance, obviously, with individual scenarios? Because something that I kind of reflect on is you don't want to kind of over project everything on the second date, right? Like you're kind of just trying to work this person out and see if they have a similar vision for life. But like, you know, as like a sandbox answer, I suppose, because it's everyone's coming at this from different angles. Is there a certain thing you should look for in terms of, okay, this person have a bit more of a serious conversation versus this person doesn't really want the same things?
Yeah, and I certainly believe there is a time and a place for spontaneity, and it's not to say that you need to kind of, write your contract for life on date number two. But I do think that there are natural times in a relationship where it does make sense to start to have these conversations. So, for example, before you go on a trip together on a holiday, right? That's a time where it might make sense to actually have a conversation about money, because often in the early stages of a relationship, either both people pay for themselves or one person covers both, but you're not really talking about larger financial implications. Well, if you decide to tether your life to someone, obviously there are major financial implications. So somewhere between date number two and when you walk down the aisle, if you do decide to get married, you should have a conversation about money. And travel is a natural forcing function, right? To say, okay, we need to decide where we're going to stay. We need to decide, what level of um, restaurants we're going to eat at. Are we going to just go grab food at the local pub, or we want to have some nicer meals, and how do we approach that? So that can be, there are these natural places, again, probably before you feel ready, but that can be introductions to the types of conversations that you end up having over and over as you build a life with someone. And we have exercises in the books. Other readers have told us it's actually been very helpful to read the book with their partner, because then they can approach the exercises together and say, okay, well, I heard these authors on a podcast, and there's this book, and would you actually complete this exercise, and I'll do it too, and then we can compare. And that can be really helpful as a just as an entree into some of these conversations, because what my co-author has said, and I think this analogy really resonates. A lot of these conversations feel like you're standing on the edge of a very tall diving board, and you're like not quite, you have that feeling in the pit of your stomach. You're like, I don't know if this is the right time to bring it up. But the thing is that the diving board does not get any lower. It really, you feel that same sense of nervousness. At least I do. Now after 14 years, it's diminished a bit. You build the muscle to have these types of conversations, but the diving board isn't getting any lower, so you might as well take the leap. And if the person responds positively and is interested in having these conversations, that's a good sign. If they're resistant, or like, why are we talking about money, like that's not important right now, or like that's kind of a flag of like, well, say more about that, why is that not important? And then you start to maybe pull out some of the assumptions that they have. I mean, we all have money stories, and you'll appreciate this as a student of psychology, right? How we were raised has significant implications on how we view financial, material goods, wealth, and our experiences really shape us in our own decision making. And so, even the act of telling someone about your own experiences can be very revealing and actually help strengthen a relationship. Vulnerability is a way to strengthen a relationship, contrary to the belief that it can destroy it. So there's so much research on or out there about how that can be a source of strength and commitment.
And I'm glad we've touched back on vulnerability, because you mentioned it a little bit earlier on in the podcast, and it's something I wanted to ask you about and delve into a little bit more, because it seems to be one of those words, one of those kind of uh, traits or things that you do that is talked about so much online, and people have all sorts of conflicting opinions on, especially as a man or as a woman, what's appropriate in what context, right? And it can be quite confusing to navigate this world. I mean, I think predominantly for my audience, it's probably like just under 2/3 young men, right? Because it was obviously me. It's the kind of people that follow the podcast, and it's very much this case of like striking the balance between like the necessary ability to be a bit more forthright with stuff, but also like not suppressing and not uh, being pent up with things. And I think, especially in a relationship, when you are sharing your visions and stuff, that is, and ultimately all of your insecurities and the things that you might be struggling with and want support from, and that's obviously a reciprocal thing. Vulnerability is a really challenging but ultimately necessary thing. And so, I mean, I guess general advice, but also if you have any specific advice for I guess young guys in that scenario, like how do you try and become more vulnerable and more comfortable with doing that? Because as you say, it's a diving board, and the diving board doesn't get any lower.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is trying to disclose things again in context, right, at the right time. So if you are going away on holiday, like that's a good time to have some of these conversations. If you're going to a friend's wedding, right, that's another good time to say like, oh wow, like, you know these are the things that I have always hoped that, some, first of all, like, do I hope to get married or do I not hope to get married? Like some of these just basic things where, again, it's helpful to get them out as points of conversation. So reading the kind of context clues is helpful. And then, trust is really important for vulnerability, right? And we build trust by following through on what we say we're going to do. So even simple things like showing up for dates on time, calling or texting when you say you're going to text. Like all of those things are actually scaffolding that help to make it easier to be vulnerable with someone, because that means you're following through on something. They can trust you. Again, you want them to do the same. You want, if you feel like you can rely on someone, that's when you are more comfortable disclosing something that feels personal, or that feels like I haven't really shared this in the context of a relationship before. And all of those smaller gestures actually do provide clues and confidence to be able to have those bigger reveals. And I don't think people realize it. They don't sort of see that connection between me being 30 minutes late for a date and then therefore like why we're not having a good conversation because you've just violated, trust. Like the person was waiting there, for whatever reason like are saying your time is less important than my time, and then it's hard to expect a conversation to flow from there, right? So I think these are the things to pay attention to in a relationship, even before the big vulnerable disclosures, to make sure that you are signaling that you are someone that can be trusted and that you can trust the other person.
That's an interesting thing to consider because you're essentially saying that kind of all the small things you can do to become dependable and reliable build up where this evidence base, right? So even though there is faith and there is that leap of trust that you're never going to fully know 100% someone's intentions and how safe they are as a person or how volatile they are, you can kind of pick up on those cues. And I suppose as long as you're doing that intentionally and not overanalyzing them to be like, oh well, you were 2 minutes late here and you didn't do what you said you were going to do on this other minor thing, but just generally picking up on patterns and then actually seeing if that person is acceptable to then step into that, or whether you should raise these things as a conversation. One of the things I was going to ask off the back of something you were saying earlier was, do you think that the kind of people that are interested in this book, like you say, people were maybe attending the class or maybe reading this book and they find it helpful to sit down as a couple and go through the things? Do you think that there's like almost like a pre-selection for people who are analyzers or like pre-planners to want to then purchase the book on how to how to navigate these decisions, or do you think that's not necessarily the case?
I think there's some degree of it. Certainly, there is some bias towards wanting to be deliberate. But we have been. It's been interesting as we've been sharing the book and touring around the book. There are certainly people who we call kind of the proactive planners. Like they're the people who want to set themselves up for success. They don't maybe have children yet. They might even not know, haven't found a partner, but they want one eventually. They want a family, and they're just trying to be very deliberate. But then there are also people who are kind of in the midst of a big life decision that they're kind of thinking about. They maybe aren't planners by nature, but they're realizing that they haven't been nobody has told them how to make this type of decision, and here is a guide that they can follow and trust and help make a decision more confidently. So there we get a lot of the contemplative changers too, the like, oh, I have this job offer in this other city and I don't know really how to approach it, or I'm thinking of actually ending a relationship and I don't know if that's the right thing, so how can I use this framework and this approach not to get the outcome that I want, but to feel more confident in the process. And really that's really what the research-based approach does, is to say, we don't have a crystal ball. There are always going to be monkey wrenches that are thrown in life at us. Certainly, the last 3 years are an example of a huge monkey wrench we were all navigating. But if you do follow this process and are intentional with your approach, then it's actually you do less resulting, which is looking at the outcome to determine whether you made a good decision. You are more confident in the process, and therefore you'll be okay even if things go sideways, because you aren't going to go back in your mind and say like, oh, I should have done this or I should have approached it that way. It's like you did the best you could, and now you will see how it unfolds.
And I think that's a particularly important point to hone in on, is that I don't want to be blasé with the "it is what it is" kind of spiel, but it is true to an extent once you have considered and been intentional that and actually kind of worked hard in the context you can work hard on advancing your interests in a serving way and doing all these things. It's like beyond that certain point, then you can't really attach yourself to what the outcomes are going to be or the feedback from other people. And I guess that comes to kind of rejection in business and work and relationships as well. Is it always can be traced back to, well, as long as you're kind of operating and learning and doing those things, you shouldn't use the external as a complete judgment on what you've done, because it is reliable and unpredictable and people are coming at it from almost doing the same thing as well, but are all so different that it's, I don't know, do you see that as a problem, that people do that too much, where they kind of peg themselves to the outcomes and then get depressed and lost as to why they've ended up in scenarios?
Yeah, I think it's very human to do that, right? Is to first of all, we think we overly index on our role in things, right? And so we take things so personally. And I'll give you an example, which is that now that I am doing speaking, and I launched this Money and Love Institute that is built around the tools and the frameworks of the book, and so doing workshops and speaking, and I have information that I gathered in the marketplace around what I should be charging for these different events. And it's tempting when someone comes back and says, unfortunately that's not going to work for us, to say like, oh, it's that they don't want me, right? But it's that it's just not in their budget, right? And it's a different, it sounds subtle, right? It's like not that they're rejecting me, it's just that their budget doesn't fit what the market that I am asking for. And so I've had to do some work actually personally to detach myself from saying like, well, should I be charging less or should I, but it's like, no, I've done the research, I've tested this, and it's just not going to work out for everyone. And I think that's can apply the same thing in relationships, right? It's like I've been myself, I've been as honest and vulnerable as I feel like I wanted to be or was appropriate to be. And if it's just, not a fit, not to say like there's something wrong with me, but it's just that, this wasn't meant to be, or this wasn't a fit for that person. And it's very hard to do. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is just say it's not a fit. Like it can be devastating to realize that the person who you want to spend time with and tether your life to doesn't feel the same way. But, Myra, my co author, always had students write to her at the end of the semester or even years later and say, thanks to what I learned in your class, I actually decided to break up with my partner. And I just realized we weren't going to have the relationship long term that was going to support my goals. And she would always say, I'm so sorry. I know that it's not easy, but so much better that you learned this now than after many years of marriage and children and all the other things. And I think that's the case.
Yeah, it's just not allowing you to helplessly float through life and then question things afterwards. I think that's the really important thing of having the framework that you've kind of laid out in the book that has emerged out of the class is just the tools to navigate really complex decisions. I mean, that's all I can distill it into. And I kind of want to embed that back into your own sort of personal journey, because I actually had someone on the podcast probably about 4 or 5 months ago who never lectured me, but she was a lecturer at the uni I went to. And she did a lot of research papers on the bright side of motherhood was one of the titles of her paper. And she obviously is a working mother. She's a professor, senior lecturer at University of Surrey, but also has a little daughter and is growing a family and making a life in that regard. And it fascinated me to have that conversation, because I feel like, as you said, like right at the beginning of the podcast as well, we're almost like sold this thing of like do everything, but then not really given the tools, especially as women, kind of in the last kind of, I don't know, 80 years. And we're coming into this time where it's really hard to support a family with a single income if it's just the guy, and then if the woman wants to work, okay, how do you then also not mitigate the like huge responsibility and like honor and joy that you have to like raise children, right? And it's like trying to make sense of all of that. So I won't keep talking. What was your journey like as you were making the decisions to obviously with your partner to be like, okay, we want to have kids, but you also want to keep working on this stuff, right? So
Yeah, well, I think because we had the benefit of studying with Myra in the class, we had those conversations early on about the fact that we were both ambitious. We both wanted full careers. We both wanted a family. And we had some conversations early on about religion and some of those things that were important. So we had talked a lot about a family, but it was interesting. We joke that we had this rolling 2-year plan of having kids. Like we got married and then we said, okay, well, in the next 2 years we'll start a family. And there's really never a good time to say let's disrupt our entire life. Like we like our weekends. We like cooking together. We like, doing all these things. Like, let's just mess that all up, right? So, that we got to that 2 years and we said, okay, well, you know what? In the next 2 years, we'll have kids, right? So it was not one that was easy for us to just jump into. It was daunting. And as a planner, you can't really plan, is the thing, exactly how it's going to work, because there's lots of factors out of your control in terms of biology, et cetera. And so, I actually remember I was in a job at the time that I wasn't loving. And I had, all the research from Myra's class in my head of, women who step out of the workforce when they become parents have huge financial penalties that they never recover from. And I didn't want that to happen to me, but this was not a job I wanted to stay in for a long time. And so I actually hired a coach because I felt like I needed to have a thought partner who was not my romantic partner to talk through some of this stuff with, because some of it was internal to me that I, kind of needed to grapple with. And this was very much an example of woman plans, God laughs, or man plans, God laughs, because I started working with this coach to talk about, whether to move forward and try to start a family or whether to find another job. And meanwhile, it took my parents a very long time to have me. So they ended up trying for, a dozen years before they were able to successfully have a child. And so I just, in my mind, said, well, this could take a really long time. So while I'm grappling with this with my coach, let's just sort of see how things play out. And lo and behold, like a month later, I was pregnant. And so with the conversation with my coach became less about like how to sequence this perfect series of events. And then it was, okay, you're going to have a kid. How do you sort of arrange your life so that you don't derail your career ambitions while, when you have a child? And it's very interesting because as a planner, I realized the universe works in mysterious ways. And I had sort of come to terms with the fact that I was going to be in a job that wasn't ideal for a little bit longer because I wanted to have maternity leave, have kids, et cetera. And then I got a call from a previous boss that I had interned with at the Gap. And she said, we have a new role on the team and we're interested to know if you want to apply. And I said, oh, well, this actually sounds like my dream job. But just full disclosure, I'm about to have a baby. I wouldn't be able to start right away. And to their credit, they said, well, if you're interested, apply. And I did. And I went through the whole interview process, getting bigger every time I would sit down for an interview. And I ended up getting an offer. It was, I remember very vividly, I got an offer on a Wednesday. I accepted it on Thursday. And then my oldest son came 2 weeks early and I had him on Friday. So it was like this very wild series of events that suddenly I had a new job and a new baby and an old job that I hadn't even quit yet because I didn't have time before the new baby came. So it was a whirlwind, but the universe, as I mentioned, works in mysterious ways because it was my dream job. And I did get to take 4 months of maternity leave. And then I started in that new job. And that's the one that I stayed in for a decade, and I had another baby while I was there, helped to start this group for working parents, because while there were a lot of other working parents at the Gap, it was a very family friendly company. There was not an intentional community for those parents to come together to talk about all the things involved in parenting and performing at work. And fortunately, we stood up that group in the spring of 2019. And a year later, the pandemic hit, and it was so wonderful to have that community, and so important, life sustaining for all the people who were grappling with uh, caring for young children and working at the same time as they were dealing with all the things we were all dealing with during lockdown.
And I'd love to ask a question off the back of that. And obviously, it's going to be personal to you, but I wonder in your answer if you could, obviously then relate that to many people's experiences. But in terms of your own desire to have a family and children, and then I'd imagine, did you go back into full time work
I
at some
did, yeah.
stage?
Well, it was right away. Like that job at Gap was full time the whole time. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So how did you try and like navigate that? Given I don't know, because I think at least from my perspective, I see the career as like fantastic and a great thing, and you can do so much like positive change. But ultimately, in my way of thinking for things, the career is subservient and does serve the ultimate career, which I see as like motherhood and family and fatherhood as well, and rearing the children. And so, how did you kind of approach that, and what was your perspective? And then, kind of out of navigating that, what is your kind of advice for people who may be approaching that, or maybe are, you know, my age and single and have no idea, but are just curious and kind of forward planning like I am?
Yeah, no, I love the forward planners, as you know, I am one. Um, Well, I think that's where having these conversations well before babies actually arrive really serves you because, you know, my husband knew and obviously was very supportive of me pursuing this new job even as we were going to become parents and knew that what that meant is we were committing to paying a lot for childcare because we did not have family in the area that could be helpful to us in the childcare role. So we knew, okay, this was going to be something that we would put a significant amount of money towards. And we live in a very expensive city in San Francisco, so we were well aware of sort of the cost of that. We also had discussed what that meant in terms of taking, you know, significant roles in raising the child as well as household chores. And but you can have all these conversations in theory, and then, you know, when when the moment hits and you have, you know, a new baby and you're sleep deprived and you're, you know, in the case of, you know, having just given birth, there's hormones, like there's all this stuff. It's hard for cool heads to prevail every single moment. And so it's important to kind of give yourselves grace. We had, you know, lots of conversations that we were like, okay, I know I'm not at my best now, but, you know, let's just take a walk and then we can come back for this conversation. So just even that self-awareness of knowing like it's one of the biggest stressors on a relationship, but it can also be, again, something that really brings you together. And I remember very vividly this one specific conversation we had. So I was in this new job with a 4-month old. I was committed to breastfeeding. And so that meant when I was at work, I was pumping milk to come home and, you know, be able to give our son bottles while I was away at work. So we had a, you know, nanny who was doing that. And it was a lot with a new job and, you know, this sort of new routine to navigate 3 times a day in the beginning. I mean, it was just, I felt like I was just, you know, doing the bare minimum at work, frankly, and then, you know, pumping milk, and it was all too much. You have to come home and then you have to like clean the parts, and it's just like, you know, it's just a lot. And so I said to him one night, you know, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Like, this is just too much. I feel like yeah, like I'm not doing a good job of either thing. And then it was like my turn to cook dinner. And I'm like, and I don't even know, you know, like how I'm going to make dinner. And he said, okay, well, how about this? You feed him and I will feed us. And so he just like took over my dinner responsibilities and was like, you just like go take a minute. I will get our food together. Like, you feed him. And that was over 10 years ago because our older son is 10 and a half, and he has continued to take full responsibility for food in our house. So he does all the meal planning, all the shopping, all the cooking, and my kids have only seen their dad as the head chef, and they think it's funny when I cook. And so that's an example of like a small, seemingly small in the moment decision that actually has served us so well because he actually loves cooking. Like, it's a form of creative expression. Now, does he love making dinner every night? Probably not. But he really has thrived in that role. And it has freed up a huge amount of mental energy for me to be able to do things like write a book alongside a full-time job, like be the type of mother, you know, I want to be to now 2 sons. And it really, you know, one of the things we talk about in our book is just being as clear as possible about those types of chores and who is doing what, and it doesn't have to be exactly 50-50, but it has to feel equitable. And certainly when there are big changes like welcoming a child, you need to redistribute things because responsibilities are really different, and it's so hard to envision what that will be like on, you know, the others, like before you cross that bridge. So that's just one example from my own life, just to say, this is something that helps us. And we have a exercise in the book all about dividing chores that you can do theoretically, but then when you start to have, shifts to your family and you evolve, you can actually do very practically.
It's like meshing spontaneity with planning of, okay, we're spontaneously having this conversation because clearly one of us is struggling here, or one of us is not really sure what's going on, and okay, great, let's see how this plays out, and then also you follow that plan and then just kind of monitor it over time. And I think that's why obviously communication is so important, and not being, I don't know, too entrenched within the role that you see yourself as. And this applies to pretty much everything, right? Work and relationships, is just being able to be adaptable to scenarios as they happen, right? Have you found that in any other kind of place in work that you've had, in terms of being adaptable in your career, and how your temperaments kind of come at that?
Absolutely. So we were both working in corporate jobs for most of our marriage and most of our relationship, and then when the pandemic hit, my husband was a CFO of a technology company, and I was leading the foundation at Gap. And we had two young children who were in Zoom kindergarten and Zoom second grade at that point, which was just a recipe for disaster for everyone. And we had multiple university students coming in to tutor our kids and just to help make sure that they were even getting on the Zooms they needed to be on while we were like off trying to do our jobs. And there were two wonderful students that were helping us. Both of them were studying nursing, and within a couple months of each other, they said, "Oh, I really want to actually get a nursing job, and so I'm not going to be able to continue working with you." And it was this real decision point for us, because we could have kind of found more tutors and continued to kind of outsource things. But we also knew that there were like a whole host of risks at that point to welcoming additional people in our house. And my mother at that point was just in the process of dying, and so there were reasons why we needed to be careful, more careful than otherwise. But also, my husband wasn't actually loving what he was doing professionally at that point. He had been there for a number of years, and it had just felt like maybe time for him to start thinking about his next thing. And so he ended up um, deciding to leave that role and to focus on full-time parenting, so that our kids could have their dad more present in their lives when they were navigating an unfamiliar situation that was, again, not great for anyone, but certainly not real young kids, elementary age kids. And I had committed to had this big leadership role at work, and I was working on the book. And so part of our deal was, this he had taken this class, he knew how important this topic was, he supported my dream to help get this material in the hands of people who would never be able to study with our professor. And so he also said, yes, okay, I'm willing to do this. But then I knew that he wanted to do something entrepreneurially on the other end. And so I was the one who had the stable paycheck, the health insurance, kind of all the things that were supporting our family. And when our kids got into a more stable place and then schools eventually reopened, he ended up starting his own company. And I stayed in my role probably a bit longer than I might have otherwise to support him in his entrepreneurial aspirations of standing up his next venture. And so that's the thing about now that we've been married for 14 years, is that it doesn't feel exactly even at any single one moment, but over time it does actually, if you are intentional and you have these conversations deliberately, um, even out to a point where everyone is able to get their ambitions advance their own ambitions with the support of a partner. And so now we're in this phase where we're both in entrepreneurial ventures, and that's like a whole other adventure that we're navigating. But we've been planful about it, and we've set aside funds to be able to do that. And so it's one of those things where it's not boring, I will tell you that, and it certainly is a gift to be able to do that with a partner, to evolve in your career and your and your life with someone who is supportive.
And I appreciate you kind of unpacking that journey of the way that I don't know the pendulum swings in certain times of life, and the way you're able to navigate that, and obviously now reflect back and see the strengths and the reasons why. And I'm sure there were lots of micro challenges along the way that would be far too much to go into detail. But I think when we come into life with our, at least for myself, and I'm sure many of the listeners, with presupposed theories about how things are going to go and certain roles and certain dynamics, ultimately you've just got to have those conversations and then act on the whatever the best decision is going to be. And so whether that's going to be in your scenario, focusing on your job, pandemic, fatherhood, and then allowing that to then shift through into entrepreneurship and then the journey that you're both going on now, it's like it wouldn't really have worked as well if you'd been too kind of entrenched in the habits and routines that you were set in. And I do want to briefly touch on entrepreneurship more generally, because it's something that you're stepping into a little bit more now, and it's something where naturally as a podcast I've almost pre-selected for a lot of entrepreneurs, because it's the people that are just like doing cool stuff that you want to interview, right? um Not that people can't have incredible lives and journeys through just kind of having a steady career, but obviously there's something to be said for someone pursuing their passion and the pitfalls and risks that's associated with that. But I've interviewed a number of young entrepreneurs, and it's really interesting to observe that like a common thread through a lot of those conversations is, and I'm sure we've touched on it in pieces throughout the podcast, but the contention between like living in the moment and planning for the future. And I just wonder, in your like, from your perspective, what do you think most people do too much of? And like off the back of that, how can people do less of it? If that makes sense.
Well, I think, there are a couple of trends that are making it more important than ever to be intentional about um, making big decisions, including starting a company. And you touched on one, which is dual career couplehood. That having, it's really not the norm. Frankly, we have the majority of millennials. 75% of millennials in with married couples with children have both work outside the home. And so that's a significant trend. The other trend that's worth noting is longevity, because demographers estimate that people today, a child born today, will live to be over 100. And that means that this journey that we have all, this three-phase life that we've sort of all had in our minds of, you spend 20 years getting educated, and then you work, and then you retire. When you just stretch out the work part, if you live longer, and it just means you can't actually retire at 60 or 65, and you just have to stretch out the work part, it doesn't actually work. And you want these extra years to be a gift and not a burden. And so I think that in being planful about the future doesn't need to be um, something to be wary of. And in fact, I think that I've been spending a lot of time talking to financial planners, because that group has emerged as an audience that is very excited about the concepts of the book, because they are a group that people turn to for expertise in how they should think about their finances. But there's always relationship decisions underneath those financial decisions, and they're not given any training in those. And so the types of conversations and the tools and the frameworks that we talk about in the book are very helpful, and something that we're starting to do some more collaborations with financial planners. And I'll tell you that when my husband and I were both trying to make this decision about whether to both be entrepreneurs at the same time, which required a lot of financial planning, because we still have kids that need to be supported, and still live in a house and have to pay for that. The financial planner that we were talking to at the time said, well, our model isn't really built to help you figure that out. We can kind of plug in some zeros for a number of years and see what that does to your retirement savings, but it doesn't kind of do the thing you're asking us to do. And I think that, we are not given the tools to do the type of advanced planning that we want to do and that we're going to be required to do as we all live longer, as we need to navigate two careers. And so I think that it's not our fault that we don't do that type of planning, because we haven't been taught to do it. And even this whole industry that exists to help us be more deliberate about how we're using our funds to support our ambitions and our desires is not really built to help us do that. And so I think it's, to answer your question, that was a very long answer. I think more people live in the moment, but not because for lack of desire to be planful, it's for lack of support and lack of, again, the right tools and the way of thinking to help to be planful. So that's the mission that I'm on now, is to really help uh, equip the experts with tools to facilitate more deliberate decisions that everyone feels more confident about. Those experts feel more confident about, that the clients feel more confident about, and so that it you're actually being able to make decisions with intention in a way that support your goals and desires.
Hmm. And like as well as money, it's just purely how you allocate your time, and the concept of like the delaying of gratification, right, is a huge one that's kind of emerged out, and it's definitely something that I've very much valued in my life, but it's something that I've been challenged on by people who potentially live more in the moment and more spontaneous than me, as to you're not having enough fun. Like you kind of just going like robotically, like, oh well, obviously the podcast is a good example, as doing something on the side of a full-time job and trying to do triathlon training and all this kind of stuff. It's like it's squeeze, and that those are all things that you can say there's compound interest and doing the habits over time, kind of building for the future. But it's also like trying to make sure that I'm not allowing my early 20s to run away from me in thinking about a future that it's like a runaway train, because I'm never actually like living in the moment and experiencing what life has now, in terms of, oh, these people want to do this now, okay, go and do that with them, or maybe make pay for something that I hadn't planned for, but it's like, cool, yeah, because the opportunity is there, right? And I think that's certainly something that I've been meditating on, and it's certainly something that has emerged as a theme from the young entrepreneurs, in having, I don't know, like being able to purchase stuff now, as opposed to just thinking about reinvesting everything back into the business. And I suppose that's something that you have experienced in your life and are going to experience with the entrepreneurship journey moving forward. And I
But
do want to ask a question about that.
well,
More,
can I say one thing? Because I do think, I mean, people have different interpretations of fun, right? And so for you, like, do you have fun doing the podcast?
yeah, yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay, so for someone that might seem like work, and for you, it's fun. It's a source of energy and renewal and all of those. And so I think sometimes we get caught up in someone like, oh, you're not having that much fun. Like, you should have more fun. Don't just go home and do your podcast on the weekends. Like, come out with us. But for you, like that, and that's really about knowing yourself and having that clarity. Like, again, that first C, to say, sure, like I will come meet you for a drink, but I am going to record this podcast first because that is fun for me. And so part of that is just like that self-awareness. And my husband and I do a lot of hiking, and we do that. We one of the reasons we live where we live, it's one of the things we love to do on vacation. And I was talking to a friend recently, and I said, she said, did you get to relax a lot on vacation? And I said, we didn't relax a lot, but we went on some amazing hikes. And she's like, oh, that is not relaxing. And I was like, well, actually for me it is. Like, I really get, it's one of the ways I experience awe, is like being in these stunning settings. Love to get the endorphins. Like, there are elements of relaxation that come from hiking for me. Definitely different for different people. And so that's partly of like just knowing that everyone is different. That's part of the beauty of the world. But you have to have that self-knowledge to be okay with someone saying like, well, that vacation doesn't sound relaxing, but that's cool because it was for me.
That's a It's a clear example there, because I'd be the exact same on holiday, and my family the same as well. Where I think my experience growing up is the family would be very the holiday would naturally be planned, but it would also just be like just doing loads of stuff, like going on walks, hiring some bikes, going and seeing what's happening in the village. And as I would just look at the people who just go to a villa in Spain and just lie down for 7 days, and you're just thinking, well, sure, like there's a time and place for everything, but not my idea of fun. And I suppose just having an appreciation of that and not diminishing that because of my preferences is also important, I guess. Um, but yeah, one of the questions I wanted to ask to kind of bring the podcast more into yourself in the future, and out of that, I'm sure there'll be lots of lessons for people who might be wanting to set up their own businesses or having ideas and moving forward. Like how do you envision the more entrepreneurial side of money and love that's emerging out of just writing a book in terms of the courses? I mean, I'm relatively unfamiliar, so I'm pretty much just asking off the top of my head, how long this has been going for, what the vision for it is, and the future, because it's something that is very interesting, and I'm sure many people would be interested in something like what you're suggesting. So yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. Well, my hope was that there would be a business that would emerge out of the book. I didn't know going in, but when we were doing the talks and the touring that we were fortunate to be able to do, I was paying attention to what are the people who are coming up afterwards asking us, what are the types of things that people want to know more about. And one, as I mentioned, one of the groups was financial planners who were interested. There were also a number of coaches who said, I help my clients make big life decisions about job to accept certain jobs, or to how to kind of organize their lives to help them reach their goals, and these tools would be helpful for us. And therapists were another group. They help people with romantic decisions and relationship decisions, but don't have training typically on the financial aspects, right? So it does occupy this interesting space that bridges a lot of disciplines and allows more holistic decisions to be made. And so part of that was part of the genesis, and we actually did a couple of talks where people came up afterwards. I'm thinking of a talk we gave at Stanford at the Longevity Center, where someone came up who said, I founded this wealth advisory company, and we would love to have you come train our advisors in your framework and how to have these conversations with our clients in a more holistic way. And so that was work we started doing even before the institute existed. But I started to have more of these conversations and realize, okay, there is a there. It's always a bit of a leap of faith, but I felt like I had tested and there was some early pilots going that made me feel like there could be more here. And so that literally just launched the website last week, so it's brand new. I mean, the wheels have been in motion for a couple months, but moneyloveinstitute.com is the website that talks about what we do and the services we have, which some of them are courses. So we have a self-paced course that gets delivered to people's phones. We also are going to have a live cohort-based course for people who like to learn in a group. We do talks and workshops around the topics of money and love and big life decisions. And then more customized collaborations like the one I was describing with the wealth advisory firm. And so excited about that. But I want to go back to something you asked, which is sort of about the delayed gratification and the kind of planfulness, because you know one of the things that the life decisions that I made earlier on this journey using the framework, and we haven't gone through it all, so maybe I'll just run through it quickly so people have it, which is to clarify what's most important to you, communicate with the other person or people involved in the decisions, examine a wide range of choices, check in with friends, family, and trusted resources, and consider the likely consequences in both the near term and the far term. And so, using that framework, my husband and I had made a decision to stay in our current home instead of moving to a bigger home. We thought we wanted a bigger space when we were all cooped up in the pandemic and on top of each other, and wishing that we had more space. But actually, as we walk through that framework, it's iterative, right? So we started out clarifying that we wanted bigger space and schools that were open. But then once we went through and considered the consequences, and financially it would actually tether us to closer to those jobs that we knew eventually we wanted to be doing something more entrepreneurial, and it wouldn't be possible for many more years if we took on a bigger mortgage and bigger obligation for a bigger house. And so we had made the decision very consciously to stay in our current home, which is not big. It's a pretty small footprint home, and but it is funding these entrepreneurial endeavors because we did not take on additional debt to move to a bigger home. And so I just say that to say, it is, still a risk that to have two entrepreneurial things happening at once, but it was predicated on this bigger agreement we had that career flexibility was more important to us than, upgrading our home to the bigger model with the, bigger bedrooms. Our boys still share a bedroom and a bunk bed, and those are trade-offs that we're comfortable making. But it does involve making trade-offs, and I want that to be very clear. We're not saying you can have it all. You can, have the entrepreneurial jobs and just do what you want. It's like, no, just be very clear about what you want and be very clear that there are going to be trade-offs, but then we're very comfortable with those trade-offs because we made them deliberately.
Don't know if this is really a question you can answer, but like out of the five C's, what do you think you struggle with or will struggle with the entrepreneurial journey the most?
It's a good one. Well, I think one of the things I'm very clear about is that I want to have more flexibility than when I was working in a job that I was managing across many different time zones. And that meant that I was in meetings from, very early in the morning, my time in San Francisco, because I had a team in Asia, all the way through, the evening, because a lot of the executive team was based in San Francisco. And I'm very clear on that, but I'm also a very ambitious person, and certainly owning your own business is very demanding. And so I think it's about being very clear about setting this business up in a way that allows me to have that flexibility, but not recreating the conditions that I shifted in order to start this role. So that's something I'm thinking a lot about right now, and I've just read this fantastic book. I actually just started a newsletter, and I interviewed the author of this book, Shorter, who also wrote a book about rest. His name is Alex Pang. I interviewed him for my first newsletter because he writes a lot about the 4-day work week and how to help companies implement a 4-day work week. That's what he's doing now at this 4-day week global organization. And I'm trying to set up the Money and Love Institute with the principles of Shorter to be as effective and as mission driven and as successful as it can be, while still allowing me to have a lot of the things I value outside of work is a big part of my life. So that's the intentional work that I'm doing right now.
I see a lot of really good stuff shared online from a number of creators who very much so almost not even like the 4-day working week, but also like the 4-hour working day, as I've seen proposed, in terms of these concepts of like flow state and focus, and actually just nailing really quality time worked can actually you can get almost more done than you would if you sat at a desk at a 9 till 5, where there's kind of dead time and meetings that could have been emails and all these different things.
Totally.
Whereas actually, as an entrepreneur, if you're disciplined enough, if you come up with it with the right perspective, you can prioritize things in your life within work and outside of work far better, rather than being at the mercy of, you've got to clock out at 5:30 every day kind of thing. So
Totally. And
um,
that's a lot about the choices, right? So I think that making sure you're looking at the broad range of choices. For me, it's not going to be a 4-day work week either, but it is going to be, a time bound amount of time that I am dedicating to this, which is not going to be, a 9 or 10 hour day, the type that I used to have in my corporate job. But I think it's about being aware that there are more choices available to you than just the dominant models that we kind of see, and certainly the ethos, especially in Silicon Valley, of just working all the time and grinding and not even taking meal breaks, just have your soylent sort of thing. It's like, no, this is not what I'm trying to do as an entrepreneur, and I know I absolutely believe there's a different way.
I think that message has been an overarching one throughout throughout this conversation of just being introspective and working out why you want to do things, and ultimately then following the framework to then gain clarity and gain a little bit of an understanding of how you should make the decisions, both at the micro level and also the big decisions, which obviously the book is primarily focused on. Um, are there any other kind of moving forward in your life which you think would be helpful to share for the listeners?
Yeah, well, I mentioned briefly that I started this newsletter. So it launches later this month, and it's called Practically Deliberate. So all of the wordplay intended. It's about
Yeah.
being deliberate nearly all the time. So practically all the time, and then also being pragmatic about being deliberate. So not just planning for the sake of planning. Allowing spontaneity to come in where it makes sense, and then also practically deliberating, because I am one that is prone to careful consideration, but trying to not get stuck in analysis paralysis, to bound it in a way that makes sense. And so I'm excited to pursue some more writing, because I love that part of the book process of the actual writing of it. And my as I mentioned, the first one is really focused on this idea of deliberate rest. So what Alex Pang writes about in his first book, Rest, is that rest can be active, and it actually is work's ally and not work's enemy. And so building in very focused time throughout your day and your week to have something that is not work, but it is a focused effort that you pursue. Right now, for me, that's tennis. I'm taking tennis, and have really been enjoying picking back up a racket after 15 years. And so the play with tennis and then writing of the newsletter is really exciting to me.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I'll have to look into. I'll look forward to when that newsletter is released, and I'm sure I'll share it if it's. I found a lot of value from it, which I'm sure I will. Um, Elsewhere, then, how can people get in touch or follow you or buy the book if they're interested in some of the things that have emerged from this conversation?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the book website is moneylovebook.com. The institute website is moneyloveinstitute.com. And I am on LinkedIn. That's kind of the main platform I use, is Abby Davisson. And then I am on Instagram at abby.davison as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time. As I said at the beginning, it's been a really interesting conversation for me personally, and I hope it has been for all the listeners and for you, of course, as well. So thank you.
Yes, this has been great. Thank you so much.